Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to welcome you again today. I'm Lauren Borchard, Director of Historical Programs at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, coming to you from a rainy day here in Washington, D.C., but bringing you a little sunshine with today's program, Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. Today, Steve will be talking about First Street Northeast near C Street and Constitution Avenues. I'll turn it over now to Jane Campbell, President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We really appreciate the work that you've done to become an overnight Zoom expert so that we can bring our programs to our audience, our members, our supporters, and the new people who we have picked up who are now able to watch our programming from anywhere they might be. We are really working hard at the United States Capitol Historical Society to keep our work alive as we are in the stay-at-home mode, trying to stay at home and stay safe. And what we've done is transformed our speaker series into a virtual series. And the amazing thing that gives us great joy is that we now find that our audience comes from all over the country. And in fact, some we've even had from overseas who have joined in, who love the idea and the understanding of the United States Capitol as a symbol of American democracy, a symbol of freedom around the world. Today, we are going to hear from someone who has really dedicated his professional life to telling the story of the United States Capitol, the work of the people in the Capitol, and how that building and the grounds and the neighborhood that has developed around it is a way that we understand the history of this country. We also want to say one thing that we say every time, but we really want to continue to point out how grateful we are for the support of Capitol Historical Society members and donors. These programs are only available because of the generosity of your support. And now that we have the Capitol closed and we are reaching out virtually, that support is more important than ever. And so for those of you who are able to make those gracious gifts, thank you very much. One of the other ways that you can help the Society is by sharing the information about these seminars and webinars with people who may not know about us before. So send the information to your friends, family, no matter where they are. They can join in now that we're virtual, and we're happy to have them. And we always remind you that one of the ways we support the Society is with commemorative merchandise. You can see the commemorative brooch that we have with the eagle that I am wearing on display so that you can see that you can own such a thing. And Steve, our model for the Bermuda tie with the blue, this is the blue version with the eagle. He will be modeling that all during his presentation. So that is the end of the commercials, which, you know, every good show has to have a little commercials. So now the main event. Steve Livengood, many of you have heard me introduce him over and over, but we always know that every session there's some new folks. Steve has been providing tours of the Capitol and the Capitol grounds and the Capitol neighborhood for over 50 years. And this particular series is based on a book that the Society researched, prepared, printed, and is distributing called Creating Capitol Hill, the places, the proprietors, and the people that make up the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And so today, Steve Livengood, the Society's own chief tour guide, is going to take us to the corner of First Street Northeast and C and Constitution Avenue and walk us down that area with what's been the history of that area and what's there now and what can we learn about the Capitol Hill neighborhood from this conversation. Again, we invite you to put your questions. We'll include them as Steve is going along and certainly at the end of his presentation. Thank you for being with us. Steve, take it away.
Good afternoon. Here we'll start again with L'Enfant's map in 1792, and this is showing you the block that we're going to be talking about here. It's a block away from the Capitol, and what you can see here, this is the 1801 map, and you can see that the street isn't even laid out yet. These little X's are boundary stones, so that indicates where the street's going to be, but the street hasn't been cut yet. So here's some more boundary stones up here. So we're talking about this intersection up here mostly, but obviously nothing's going on here by 1801. Now this is the Latrobe map from 1815. And again, I've marked it, but not much going on there. No buildings that they paid much attention to. All of this area is controlled by the developer, the owner of the property, Daniel Carroll of Duddington. And a date to keep in mind is that by 1819, he has pretty much withdrawn from the situation. He's not promoting much. He still has properties to deal with, but he's not making much money with them. This is the block as it looks today. They're working on the Senate Russell building on the left here. On the right is the Dirksen building. So it's just these two buildings across that block today, but we're going to talk about what was there before. Here it is from the other end, looking at the C Street intersection and back toward the Capitol. And this is back another block to give you a little perspective, because we're going to talk about some of this. Last week, we talked about this house, which had been built by Buckner Thurston. And by the way, the question arose about the spelling of Thurston's name. Wikipedia and other sources have him as Thurston rather than Thurston. But as they were writing the book, the author and the editor determined that in the records that we were using, it's spelled Thurston. And so while you can't find him in Google, because that name is not up, in fact, that's what we've used as in the book. So I'm going to continue to use that. There's some question about how it was spelled. But this is the house that's on Constitution Avenue and was built about 1809 along there. Another person is William Cranch, who moves to Washington in 1791 from Boston. And he has a house somewhere around the intersection of First and C. It hasn't really been determined where that house was, but we know so many things happened there that he definitely was there. He's an interesting person. He is, in 1801, he's appointed reporter of the decisions of the Supreme Court as part of the Jefferson administration, and simultaneously he's appointed judge of the circuit court for Washington, D.C., the Federal Circuit Court. So he reports, his name is connected historically with the reports of civil and criminal cases in Washington, D.C., and those reports are among the first books ever published in Washington, D.C. He's appointed the Board of Trustees for Public Schools, taught at the predecessor of George Washington University, which was Columbia College. He taught in their law program. He's an investor in buildings. He's a trustee of Christ Church, Capitol Hill, when it's founded. And amusingly enough, he is the great-grandfather of the poet T.S. Eliot. So you can see he has a continuing legacy. He was married to the sister of James Greenleaf, and Greenleaf is the one we're going to spend a little time with here. Here's Greenleaf's portrait by Gilbert Stuart, and this is the house that Greenleaf builds on this corner in 1831. We know where it was. It was where the Dirksen building is now, on C Street, and we know that it was around the corner from Cranch's house. but we don't know where Cranch's house was, but we do know where Greenleaf's was, and this is a photograph of it from 1861, but he builds the house in 1831. He built it to retire to by that point in his life, but here's a larger picture of it. You can see and kind of see the location around. So presumably what's on the left there is First Street, and the other building is across First Street, and there's some other large buildings. So this is the area by 1861, basically what this part of the neighborhood looked like. But I want to put these two up together to kind of show an interesting contrast. If you look at the Greenleaf house, there's a house pretty much like Thurston's house in the middle there, except it's got this fancy window up here. And if you recognize that window from, I believe, the movie Amityville Horror, you know that that's a New England kind of architectural element that he has stuck on the side of a building that looks pretty much like Cranch's. You can see it's got the two dormers at the top. Cranch's only had one, but it's got the chimney position and so forth. It's basically the same building, except that he's put this window on it and these wonderful porches, 2 rows at the top and one on the lower floor here, that transform the house and make it look different. And there was comment about that in the neighborhood at the time that he built it. So that is asserting himself as somebody different. And I thought the contrast between the two houses is very interesting. It says something about the neighborhood. James Greenleaf has been characterized by one historian, one book, as, quote, the most important land speculator that the United States has produced. His family were Huguenots that settled in Boston in 1635. Greenleaf is a literal translation from the French name that they had, which I will not try to pronounce. But his father, Greenleaf's father, is quite prominent merchant. He is elected the sheriff of Suffolk County, which was a very important position in Boston at that time. And he was the one who proclaimed independence from City Hall in Boston on July 1776. James Greenleaf is the 12th of his 15 children. Greenleaf decides to go into business. He sets up a partnership with a fellow in Philadelphia and New York in 1788. And he's at the age of 23 to 27. And they decide for him to go to Holland and learn about business there and set up trading relationships. And within a very short time, within 4 years in Holland, he has made $1 million from stock sales and bond speculation. Now, this is $1 million in 1790 money. So it is an incredible amount of money that he's made as a very, very young man. He's a large shareholder in the Bank of the United States by this point, which is Alexander Hamilton's program. So with all this money, he returns to the United States in 1793 as the 27-year-old equivalent of a 21st century billionaire. Another of his sisters has married a young man named Noah Webster. Webster was a teacher, an unsuccessful lawyer, but he became prominent as a writer in defending the Constitution during the ratification process. And partly because of that, Alexander Hamilton asked him to set up the first Federalist newspaper in New York City. And he sets up the first daily newspaper in New York City called the American Minerva. He also has the ambition to write a dictionary. And James Greenleaf uses his money to finance the newspaper and to finance the creation of Webster's dictionary. So you can see these people have deep roots that still continue today. Webster decides to come to Washington, D.C., and he arrives the day before the laying of the cornerstone. This may be coincidental, but at any rate, he gets here at the right time. Oh, I forgot to show you Noah Webster here. This is what he looks like much later. And this is the partner that they get, Robert Morris. Here's Washington laying the cornerstone, and so we know that James Greenleaf was present at that ceremony that day. And so he's arrived in Washington much as Thomas Law did. We've talked about Thomas Law. Law gets here with this enormous fortune that he's made in India and starts making relationship with George Washington. Well, we know that James Greenleaf met George Washington for the first time at the laying of the cornerstone, and Thomas Law had identified Washington's step-granddaughter, Eliza Custis, and proceeds to marry her. Well, James Greenleaf identifies Tobias Lear, Washington's private secretary, who wants to leave that position and get himself set up in business. He has been sort of the adopted son of Washington since Lafayette went back to France. And so Greenleaf finances Lear's mercantile trading company here in Washington. He also meets Thomas Johnson from Frederick, Maryland, who is the one of the commissioners that Washington appointed, one of the first ones to set up the city. And so he decides to get a relationship with Johnson, and Johnson is most famous for later being the father-in-law of John Quincy Adams. But he's a land developer in Montgomery and Frederick County. Actually, Frederick County, Montgomery County was split off from Frederick County later. But he's got a lot of land out there. So James Greenleaf picks up 15,000 acres of Thomas Johnson's land to ingratiate himself. But Johnson is one of the ones in charge of the sale of lots in Washington, D.C., and this has not gone well. The Congress did not appropriate much money for setting up the city of Washington. They got the state of Maryland and Virginia to do that, but it wasn't nearly enough, and they were going to sell the lots in the city and get the money that way, and the lot sales were disappointing. So James Greenleaf steps in and to take on this same role to help them out, and he works out a deal to buy 3,000 lots. The sales have gone on for 2 years, and they're still not successful. And the commissioners need money to pay for the construction of the Capitol and the White House and all of the infrastructure. So part of the deal is, first of all, that he's going to get them really cheap. They're $66.50 a lot when they've been selling for $200 to $300 a lot. But in exchange for that, he agrees that he's going to take 1,500 of these lots, half of them in Northeast, which hadn't been selling at all in the Northeast quadrant, and he's going to loan the commissioners $2,200 per month so that they can finance the construction of the other buildings. And he promises that he's going to construct 70 buildings by the time the government arrives there in 1800. And that he's not going to sell any lots for 3 years so that he's not competing with the commissioner selling lots. And he will only build buildings on his lots. Greenleaf hires an agent to sell and mortgage the buildings in Amsterdam, where he has all of his financial connections. And he's already made millions in Amsterdam, and so he thinks he's going to continue. And that's not an unreasonable expectation. Now, he also goes into partnership with Robert Morris. Robert Morris is the richest man in the United States and is a senator from Pennsylvania. He owns millions of acres in Western New York, where he has been setting up a place for Marie Antoinette to come from France after her husband got his head chopped off. Of course, she didn't succeed in getting away with her head either, but that was one of the purposes in acquiring this land, was for her to have a place to come and bring her court. He makes a deal with Greenleaf in Western New York, and one of the people included in that deal was Aaron Burr. And there's a company set up by Dutch bankers called the Holland Land Company that takes a lot. They also get involved in the Yazoo land development by the state of Georgia in land that later became the state of Mississippi. But the state of Georgia is developing that land before the state boundaries got set up. And Robert Morris and James Greenleaf get involved in that. So with Robert Morris, he buys 6,000 more lots in DC and another 1,500 in Northeast, and 650 of them are on Buzzards Point. And the reason why they wanted that in Southwest, the reason is that there was already a development going on there by the father of Daniel Carroll of Duddington. The fathers died, but the area was surveyed, but not, and people bought land, but nothing has been constructed there. So this is what's called the Carrollsburg neighborhood in Washington. So he takes that to take it off of Daniel Carroll's inventory, and they bring in another partner, John Nicholson, who was the Comptroller General of Pennsylvania. Later on, Nicholson is impeached for self-dealing in land deals in Pennsylvania, but he's quite prominent and they bring him on. They keep buying land. Greenleaf buys the Eastern Branch waterfront where the Deepwater Port is supposed to be. He gets land in Georgetown in the West End between Georgetown and the White House, and some in Alexandria. In the Southwest, he buys some land from Notley Young. He takes 1,000 lots there along the Potomac waterfront. And among the things that happens is this is the Thomas Law House, built 1795. It still exists on the waterfront in Washington. And although there's not specific information, the most likelihood is that this James Greenleaf built this house. So by the time he's done with these deals, James Greenleaf controlled half of all the saleable federal land in Washington. There are three types of land in the Washington area. There's the federal reserved land in the part where they're going to build the buildings and the streets and so forth. There's the part that belongs to the proprietors, which is half of the area that's not reserved. And then there's the other half of the area that's not reserved is the federal land that's being sold for the cash money that the commissioners need. So of the federal land, this third category, Greenleaf is controlling half of it. He's building these 70 buildings, including the Thomas Law House. This is a third of all of the buildings that were for sale in Washington, D.C. by that point. But he hasn't got any cash. Everything he does, he's dealing credit from these Dutch banks. And so rather than put out too much money, what he does, and we think he did with the Thomas Law House here, is that he put up the walls, but half of the cost of a house at that time was in the roof. I understand that's still a pretty good rule. And so he doesn't put the roof on. So there are all these buildings all over Washington that he owns that don't have roofs on them. So he's got 70 buildings and no cash. Let's look for a moment at the issue of construction in Washington, D.C. The government is in Philadelphia. Greenleaf lived in New York with his sister and the Websters. He's 27 years old and has money to burn, but no cash, just credit, and he's got all this land and stock. But he considers himself quite wealthy, and he gives fabulous parties in New York and managed to irritate the Websters. And Noah Webster, even though Greenleaf has financed Webster's projects, Noah Webster kicks him out of the house and says, "No more parties here, move on." And this is the first indication of an impending financial disaster. We don't know whether Webster realized what was going to happen, but at any rate, he decides to separate himself. And so James Greenleaf comes to Washington, D.C. again, and this in 1794, and this time he meets Thomas Law. Now, the house is later, but this is when he comes back to Washington, ends up with this house. He meets Thomas Law and helps Law out, and he gets Law to buy 500 of his lots at $300 each. Now, he has purchased these lots just 15 months before for $80 each, and now he's selling them, 500 of them, for $300 each, and he thinks he's back on a roll. But again, his money is tied up in credit to Dutch bankers, and in 1795, there is a revolution in Holland following the French invasion. Holland had joined the first coalition against the French popular government, and they lost, and the French army is able to, they can't govern the people in Paris, but they're able to withstand the invasion from a coalition of other European countries, and they turn around and invade Holland. And so Greenleaf's money is all tied up there, and his credit is endangered. So this is when he gets together with Morris and Nicholson and starts something called the North American Land Company. And they take all of the land that all three of them are involved in and put it into one big company. They had land in New York, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, although the Georgia land was actually in what later became Mississippi. So they decide they're going to sell shares in this North American Land Company, and they hire an agent in Amsterdam. Things are looking up, and so Greenleaf is able to reconcile, at least with his sister, if not with Noah Webster. And in 1795, he buys an estate in Pennsylvania and a mansion in Philadelphia. So he thinks he's on the rise again. That was in March of 1795. By May of 1795, he defaults on his payments that he owes the district commissioners. Morris and Nicholson quickly moved to buy him out of the North American Land Company, but to do that, they loaned each other money. So they're signing loans to each other to buy out Greenleaf because nobody has any cash, and they're going to get the payments to Greenleaf over a period of 4 years. So there's no cash involved, but they've gotten him out of the company so that the company's not going to crash along with him. Now, at this point, it's been analyzed that Greenleaf was worth $5 million in 1790 money. That is $1.5 billion in 2010 money, but no cash. So he's not able to make the payments that allow him to keep the land in Washington. Even asks Alexander Hamilton has left the government at that point and setting up on his own. So Greenleaf asks Hamilton to join in with the North American Land Company, and Hamilton won't touch it. So Greenleaf then, in order to get some cash, he mortgages some land in New York that he owns, but his purchase was specified that the land could not be mortgaged. So since he mortgages it when it's not supposed to be, this is fraud. And the problem is developing. He loses both of his Pennsylvania properties at that point, the estate that he had bought just shortly before, and this Philadelphia mansion. And in October 1797, Greenleaf is sent to debtor's prison. Debtor's prison at that time was a form of bankruptcy in which they locked you up until you could get your debt settled, and you had to deal with your debtors, and you couldn't get out until you settled with them, so you couldn't run off. So that is October 1797. In February 1798, Robert Morris also goes to debtor's prison, where he was famously visited by George Washington. But by March 1798, Greenleaf is able to file for bankruptcy in all of the states where he is being sued. There was no federal bankruptcy law at that point. And by August of 1798, Greenleaf is out of debtor's prison, having made agreements with all of the creditors that are suing him. But by the summer of 1799, Nicholson is also in debtor's prison, so everybody's in trouble. And in August 1799, Greenleaf comes back to Washington, D.C. to begin to defend himself against the lawsuits. But this is a man who is not easily stopped. So that's in August 1799. He's dealing with his debts. By April 1800, he gets married. He has met a wealthy heiress in Pennsylvania, Anne Allen of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Allentown was founded by her grandfather. She's got a mansion at the center of town. But she's not dumb, and she has put her whole estate in trust to keep the debtors away that are chasing down her new husband. They lived together happily. I should say they lived happily ever after for 43 years until his death. They lived in Allentown at first, and Greenleaf did some small developments there. And by 1807, he's successful enough that he moves to Philadelphia while she stayed in Allentown, and he begins to do some development around Philadelphia. By 1816, he wants to move to Washington because after the British invasion, he knows there's going to be a lot of action here as the government rebuilds. And he still owns extensive land in Washington. So by 1826, he spends the winter here with his wife, Anne, in a rented house. And by 1828, they rent one of George Washington's houses, the fanciest houses in town that were for rent, in the summer of 1828. They even spend Christmas with the Cranches at this intersection, wherever the Cranches' house was, in 1830. And in 1831, he builds the house that I showed you. Let me go back there. He builds this house and spends the rest of his life there. It's at First and C Northeast. It had a large garden. He also is able to have a farm in Southwest and a summer house outside the city, like Lincoln's Cottage out in the county, they called it. His wife stayed in Allentown all the rest of their lives. They would visit each other, and they seem to have been happy with that arrangement. So he's living in Washington, D.C., and she is in her family home in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He makes friends with John Quincy Adams, who he would have known from when he was growing up in Boston. Adams is at this point the congressman and former president. But Greenleaf seems to have spent most of his time when he wasn't defending lawsuits, spending time reading. And when he died, he had 2,612 books in his library in the inventory of his estate. He died in 1843. He is buried in Congressional Cemetery. There are 6 Supreme Court decisions that involve him. The most famous one being Fletcher versus Peck, which was the decision about that land that the state of Georgia had sold that was actually in Mississippi. But he is one of the people named in the lawsuit, Fletcher versus Peck, which established the right of the Supreme Court to declare laws unconstitutional. The house becomes General Sherman's headquarters after the Battle of Second Manassas, and is used as a hospital and convalescent home after the Civil War. The gardens, the grounds that you can see there were rented as an orchard, and it was finally demolished in 1870, probably for a hotel or a boarding house, because that was what was happening in that neighborhood. And eventually the Dirksen Senate Office building is built there in 1858. Now we're going to leave Greenleaf and go across the street to where to this land on the left here. I'll move the arrow. Talking about this land right here, and this is what it looked like when I came to Washington, D.C. This is the new Carroll Arms Hotel.
Now, Steve, just before you get to the new Carroll Arms Hotel, someone was wanting to be sure on the map. The Greenleaf house was, can you show where that was on the map?
Okay, yes, let's go back to the map. Let's see, it's, I think, easier to go to this one.
Right.
The Greenleaf house is located right there.
Okay.
That is the corner, and the new Carroll Arms Hotel is here while we're here.
So they're almost,
Somewhere around here, probably over here, or maybe down this way is where Cranch lived.
okay. So they're almost next door to each other, the Carroll Arms Hotel.
They're right across the street from each other.
Got it. Great. Okay. Thanks.
Good. Okay, now let's go back here. So what we're talking about is the corner on the left there. The corner closest to us of the Dirksen building is where Greenleaf's house was, and then on the left is a park, and that is the location of the Carroll Arms Hotel, the new Carroll Arms Hotel. I have not been able to find information about whether there was an old Carroll Arms Hotel, but I think we can assume that there was, and probably this one was enlarged, and it was quite famous. This drawing comes from 1937, and amusingly enough, when I got on the internet to see what I could learn about the Carroll Arms Hotel, I found on eBay a brochure. And this is the brochure for the new Carroll Arms Hotel from 1937 that I bought off eBay. You can see that 2 people could stay in a large room for $2.50 a night with a connecting bath, 3 people for $3. If you wanted a large room with your own bath, for 2 people it cost you $3, and for 3 people it cost you $4. Anyway, that's the kind of thing that you paid, and then you can see the dining room and the lobby and so forth, and this is some more of the brochure. You can see here at the top on the left, they're making their connections to the colonial history. But we don't know whether the Carroll family was involved in this hotel or not, but it's just a couple of blocks from where they had had the Carroll Hotel and the tavern. So they were in the hotel business in that area anyway. This is in the brochure. These are probably the trolley lines. And this is to show you how centrally located this new Carroll Arms Hotel is. You can see it's located there on the map. It's right by Union Station and sort of between Union Station and the Capitol. We do know that Senator Harry Truman lived in the new Carroll Arms Hotel while he was a senator. But more important is, and this is a photograph that I found on the internet of the new Carroll Arms Hotel as well. But more important is this image. On the left, you can see the Dirksen building and the new Carroll Arms Hotel, showing how close it is. And on the right is the entrance to the Quorum Club. The Quorum Club became quite famous because of its connection with Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker had started out working with Senator Bob Kerr of Oklahoma, who was quite a wheeler dealer. He's the one who used to complain about how much money his wife spent, and then he'd wink at you and say, "But she can't spend it as fast as I can make it." He's an Oklahoma oil man, and he's a wheeler dealer in Washington. And Bobby Baker gets connected with him first as a page and then as secretary to Lyndon Johnson. He later is convicted of influence peddling, and while the Quorum Club still exists, they changed their name. But Bobby Baker was the one who developed the Carousel Hotel in Ocean City, which is still there. But it all ended in a scandal with hearings of the Senate, and Bobby Baker ended up in prison where he encountered Jimmy Hoffa. And he wrote some famous memoirs about his crash and burn, but spends a lot of time on his relationship with Jimmy Hoffa. Also at the Quorum Club and in the Carroll Arms Hotel is a piano player who makes jokes named Mark Russell. And those of you who are a little bit older will know Mark Russell. He later moved to another location, and that is what's behind the Carroll Arms Hotel from that photograph, and is the Monocle restaurant. And on the right in this photograph, you can see the top of the Carroll Arms of the back of the Carroll Arms Hotel. But next door to it is developed this restaurant called the Monocle, which is still there today. And here it is. I took this picture of it this week. But the Carroll Arms Hotel is gone. You can see off the right is the site where the Carroll Arms was. The Monocle building now has a wonderful plaque on it, even though it's a rather ordinary and nondescript building, but the restaurant is far more important. This is my favorite restaurant in Washington. I endorse it very, very highly. I eat there a lot. The business itself does not own the building. The building is owned by the Senate. The Senate bought up this entire lot, including the Carroll Arms Hotel, but everybody loved the Monocle restaurant so much that they've left it there until the Senate decides what they're going to do with that land, which won't be for a long time. So that's the excitement at the corners of C and Constitution and First Street Northeast. So do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We always have questions. Someone was asking, is Greenleaf housing that is now in Washington, D.C. named for this fellow?
Yes, I missed that completely. I apologize. The whole neighborhood, that happens to be, by the way, where I live, and the whole neighborhood is called Greenleaf. The point where the Anacostia and the Potomac come together is called Greenleaf's Point, even though Fort McNair is there and you don't get to see it, but you can see it from the water. That prominent point in the city is called Greenleaf's Point. The recreation center where I vote is called Greenleaf King Recreation Center, and the Greenleaf houses, Greenleaf Gardens public housing is right there. And so all of that is named for James Greenleaf, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to talk about him.
Excellent. Now, another question. The Thomas Law House was built in 1795. Is that what you said?
Yes. We know it had a roof on it by the time Thomas Law and Eliza Custis Law moved in there. They only lived there for a few months because the house they were building on Capitol Hill wasn't ready yet. And they never owned it. They just rented it for a few months, but it's now the primary site connected with Thomas Law. So they lived there, yes.
And what is it? What's its use today?
It is part of the Tiber Island cooperative housing. It was intended to be the community center, but that didn't work out very well. So I am one of the shareholders in Tiber Island, and we just sold it to some folks who are fixing it up and are expecting to move into it as a single-family house dwelling in later on this year. They've been working on it for about a year now.
Wow.
So it's being restored to usefulness that it hasn't had in a long time.
Great. And you know, you love our audience. They always are giving you the technical issues. The Monocle is actually owned by the architect of the Capitol, not the Senate itself, but the architect owns all the buildings. Kevin Mulshine reveals this to us, and of course indicates that they have a very favorable lease, so that the architect is responsible for all the buildings. We learned about Commissioner of Public Buildings just yesterday.
Yes.
And someone was asking, do you know when the Greenleaf house where Sherman later lived, when was that demolished?
1870.
And was there a particular reason it was done at that time, or is that just when it was time?
I think it wasn't useful. Nobody wanted to live in a house like that in that neighborhood. And most likely it had been abused badly when it was housing the soldiers. And so as part of the development of the neighborhood, they were building hotels and boarding houses at that point. And my guess is that's what happened.
And one of the things about the Carroll Arms Hotel is someone remembered that there was a conversation that at some point the Senate Budget Committee used that hotel. Do you know if that's? Yes,
a couple of people have told me that they remember working in that hotel. They knew it was one of the hotels. The Senate bought up the whole lot and used it as offices, probably while the Dirksen building was being constructed. But they, at any rate, they used the building as offices. There's one building left on that block which was originally the Immigration Bureau, which is now the Capitol Police Building. And so that's one that's left there besides the Monocle. But the Senate did use the Carroll Arms Hotel as offices for a while.
Okay, so that's why the Capitol Police Building is sometimes called the Immigration Building, because it once
Yes.
was an immigration building.
Yes, it still has the words immigration on the front of it, but it's dedicated to the policemen who've been killed.
Well, this is an amazing history. Do you know when was the Capitol Arms Bill? When was that hotel torn down?
In the 80s,
Okay.
I believe.
We have one of our, love our audience, Stephen Miller, who's out there listening. He said, I started working in the Senate in 1979, and I don't remember whether it was there or not, but he worked in a different old apartment building that was across the street from Dirksen.
Uh-huh.
And so obviously the Senate staff was expanding as they were looking to build those buildings.
Yes, some of the buildings around there I know were torn down specifically for the Hart building when it was built.
Yeah, that would make sense. And do you know, was Greenleaf a slaveholder?
I'm trying to think. I don't, well, wait a minute. Yes, let me look. I believe at one point, after he moved to Washington, he had to sell a couple of slaves in order to pay his taxes. So yes, he probably did, but probably just domestic.
Got it.
He certainly did not he did not try to make money at farming.
And whatever happened to the Holland Land Company?
The Holland Land Company, I believe, was finally dissolved many years later, but by the time Greenleaf came back, 1831, they still had extensive holdings in Washington, D.C. They were a major landowner for a long time, developer.
Were there residences that were on First and Constitution where the Dirksen office building, were those partly residences back in the day?
We don't have a record of that. That was not, it's not part of the book, and that it probably would have been after 1819, which is when the book pretty much stops. I would assume that there were residences there. I mean, that's what's in the picture of Greenleaf's house. We can go back, and in the background here, you can see on the left there, those are buildings, and that would, I believe that's along First Street. So in fact, there would have been, and there was this residence where the Dirksen building is now. And we definitely know there were residences where the Russell building is now.
Well, there you go. See, and here our audience chimes in. William Turk tells us, my mother grew up in the block facing the Russell Senate office building. So there were definitely residents because somebody's mama grew up there.
Yeah. And that's on First Street or on C Street?
Let's see. Mr. Turk, you're going to have to answer that question because from your, he says it was on the block between First Street, on First Street, between Constitution and the
On First Street. Ah, okay.
So that's here on First Street. He's answering. He's queuing in. This is an audience participation operation.
Good, good.
And we love getting the shared resources.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, we're coming to the end of the hour, and it is always an amazing to me that the depth of knowledge that you have about the Capitol Hill neighborhood and the people and places that have made this community such a fascinating place, that we are able to fill the hour with interesting, fascinating moments. Thank you for your time. We'll be back at it next week, and I trust our participants and audience, because you've been so great with the questions and answers. We're going to really focus on questions and answers next week. So we'll get everything you've ever wanted to ask Steve. And again, we thank you for your support, of the society, for the support of our work. We want to remind you that in addition to buying the fine tie that is displayed by Steve, or the brooch, there are opportunities to begin to plan your Christmas decorations and your gifts for your family, friends, clients, and loved ones. And I show you, this is the ornament that displays the Statue of Freedom, which we've talked about so often. It was actually our 2013 ornament, and we have a few remaining. So if there's anyone who wants that particular ornament, it is, okay, someone's telling me they can't see it. I can see it on my monitor, that it's an opportunity that you can have that for your very self, or your very own self. In addition, we have a special ornament this year to honor women's suffrage and the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. All of these things are available through the United States Capitol Historical website. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your commitment to American history. We look very much forward to being with you again next week and in the weeks ahead. Have a good day. Stay safe.